Spotify has one of the strangest business models in modern technology. Imagine building the biggest restaurant chain in the world and discovering that every time a customer walks through the door, most of the money immediately belongs to somebody else. Most founders would run away from a business like that. Daniel Ek built an empire around it. That's what makes Spotify so fascinating. Today, the company has more than 600 million users, dominates music streaming, and has survived attacks from Apple, Amazon, and Google. Yet for most of its existence, investors kept returning to the same question. If Spotify is winning, why doesn't it look like a company that's winning? The strange part is that this wasn't some hidden flaw discovered years later. The problem existed from the very beginning. In fact, Spotify's biggest weakness turned out to be the exact same thing that made it successful. To understand why, you have to remember what music looked like before Spotify existed. If you were a teenager in the early 2000s, there was a good chance your music collection lived on a hard drive packed with random MP3 files. Some songs had the wrong title. Some albums were missing tracks. Half the files probably came from places that weren't exactly legal. People spent hours downloading music because the alternatives often felt worse. Record labels were still trying to sell $15 CDs to customers who only wanted 2 songs. The music industry blamed piracy for its collapse. Piracy certainly played a role. But there was another reality that executives didn't want to admit. Illegal services were often more convenient than legal ones. A teenager sitting in a bedroom could access almost any song in the world without leaving a chair. Downloads failed all the time. Computers got infected with viruses. Files disappeared. Yet millions of people kept doing it because convenience is incredibly difficult to compete against. Once people get used to something easier, they rarely choose to go back to something harder. Eventually, Apple offered a temporary solution. The iTunes Store allowed people to buy individual songs instead of entire albums. It was a major improvement, but it didn't solve the deeper problem. It simply delayed it. Consumers were changing their relationship with ownership itself. They cared less about building collections and more about having access. They wanted every song available instantly, not tomorrow, not after a trip to a store, not after a download finished, immediately. Looking back, that shift seems obvious. At the time, it wasn't. Most companies were still thinking about selling products. Consumers were beginning to think about accessing services. That's where Spotify enters the story. Daniel Ek wasn't looking at piracy and asking how to stop it. He was asking why it was winning. The answer wasn't that people loved breaking rules. The answer was that the experience was better. It was faster, simpler, and less frustrating. Ek believed that if a legal platform could match that experience, people would stop stealing music on their own. The idea sounded almost impossible. Music licensing was a nightmare. Record labels didn't trust technology companies. Technology companies didn't trust record labels. Nobody wanted to give away control. Yet somehow, Spotify convinced the industry to take a chance. Not because labels suddenly became optimistic, but because the alternatives looked even worse. The deal seemed straightforward. Spotify got access to the music. The labels got paid. Everybody celebrated. At least initially. What almost nobody appreciated at the time was that Spotify had quietly accepted a dangerous trade-off. Most technology companies become stronger as usage increases. Spotify often became more expensive. Every new user generated more streams. More streams generated more royalty payments. Every playlist, every hit song, every hour spent listening pushed costs higher. Success wasn't solving the problem. Success was scaling it. At first, nobody cared. Spotify was growing too quickly. Users loved the product. Investors loved the growth. The music industry loved the new revenue. Everything looked like it was working. Then people started asking what happened next. By 2018, Spotify had already become one of the most influential companies in music. More than 200 million people were using the platform. The company had survived years of licensing battles, competition, and skepticism. Yet inside Spotify, one question refused to disappear. What happens if Spotify becomes the biggest music platform in history and the economics never improve? That wasn't a theoretical concern. By 2023, Spotify was generating more than 13 billion euros in annual revenue. On paper, that sounds like an incredible business. The problem was that roughly 70% of that revenue flowed straight back to rights holders before Spotify paid engineers, marketers, infrastructure costs, executives, or shareholders. Daniel Ek had built one of the most popular consumer products in the world, yet the economics still looked uncomfortable. That's when Spotify did something that confused almost everyone. Instead of doubling down on music, it started buying podcast companies. In February 2019, Spotify acquired Gimlet Media. Then, it bought Anchor. Soon after that, it acquired The Ringer. One deal after another. Wall Street started noticing a pattern. Spotify wasn't buying music businesses. Spotify was buying spoken audio. At first glance, the strategy looked bizarre. Why would the world's largest music streaming service suddenly spend hundreds of millions of dollars chasing podcasts? The answer becomes clearer when you compare a song to a podcast. Every time somebody listens to Drake, Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran, or The Weeknd, money flows toward rights holders. Spotify gets users, engagement, and market share, but a large portion of the value leaves the platform. Podcasts looked different. Spotify could own them. It could control distribution, advertising, and monetization. For the first time, executives saw a path toward building something that wasn't permanently attached to royalty payments. Then Spotify pushed the strategy even further. In 2020, reports emerged that the company had signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive deal worth more than $100 million. Later estimates suggested the total value became significantly higher. Suddenly, one podcast host was worth more than many entire media companies. A company famous for giving people access to almost every song ever recorded was now writing one of the largest checks in podcasting history. At that point, Spotify no longer looked like a music company expanding into podcasts. It looked like a company trying to escape the limitations of its own business model. By this point, Spotify had already achieved something most startups never come close to achieving. It had changed consumer behavior on a global scale. Millions of people stopped downloading MP3 files. Millions stopped buying songs individually. An entire generation got used to opening a single app and expecting almost every song ever recorded to be waiting there. That should have made Spotify untouchable. Instead, the company kept running into the same problem. The bigger Spotify became, the more obvious it was that somebody else still owned the most valuable part of the business. In 2023, roughly 74% of all streams on Spotify came from catalogs connected to Universal, Sony, Warner, and Merlin. Daniel Ek had built the largest music platform on Earth. Yet most of the music people actually opened the app for was controlled by a handful of companies. Spotify owned the roads, but someone else owned most of the cars. That reality became impossible to ignore in 2014 when Taylor Swift removed her entire catalog from the platform. Not one album, everything. At the time, she was one of the biggest artists in the world. Imagine Netflix waking up one morning and discovering that Stranger Things, Wednesday, and Squid Game had all disappeared overnight. That's roughly what it felt like. Swift argued that streaming undervalued music. She called Spotify an experiment and said she wasn't willing to contribute her life's work to it. Spotify pushed back. Daniel Ek publicly defended the platform and pointed to the billions already paid to the industry. Fans picked sides, artists picked sides, the media picked sides, but beneath all the headlines sat a much larger issue. Taylor Swift didn't expose a PR problem, she exposed a power problem. Spotify couldn't force artists to stay. It couldn't force labels to license their catalogs forever. It couldn't wake up tomorrow and decide it owned the music. The company that controlled how people listened to music still didn't fully control the thing people came for in the first place. Investors noticed. Revenue was growing. Subscribers were growing. Monthly active users were exploding. Yet every earnings report led back to the same question. Why wasn't scale fixing the business? In most technology companies, scale behaves like a superpower. Add more users, spread costs, improve margins. Spotify seemed stuck in a different universe. Every additional listening hour created additional royalty obligations. The platform was becoming more dominant without becoming dramatically more powerful. One analyst described the business as a toll road built on land owned by somebody else. Spotify collected the traffic. The landowners still had leverage. That explains why the podcast strategy mattered so much. It wasn't just about growth. It was about ownership. For the first time, Spotify saw a path toward building content that couldn't be pulled away by a record label negotiation. But owning content created a completely different set of problems. Songs rarely generate headlines. Podcast hosts do. Joe Rogan wasn't sitting quietly inside a playlist. He generated controversy, political debates, media pressure, and public backlash. When criticism around the show intensified, Neil Young removed his music from Spotify in protest. Joni Mitchell followed. News outlets covered the story for weeks. Suddenly, Spotify found itself trapped in arguments that had almost nothing to do with music. The company had spent years fighting licensing battles. Now, it was fighting culture wars. While all of that was happening, another strange story was quietly developing inside the platform. Most users never noticed it. Many artists didn't know it existed. Even people inside the music business were surprised when they started looking into it. Spotify's most popular background playlists were increasingly filled with artists almost nobody had heard of. No major concerts, no interviews, no fan communities. Sometimes no visible online presence at all, yet millions of streams kept appearing. Investigations later suggested that many of these tracks could be traced back to a surprisingly small network of producers responsible for hundreds of artist identities and thousands of songs. The reason people became suspicious was simple. These tracks were often cheaper, lower royalty costs, fewer negotiations, less leverage from major labels. That led to an uncomfortable question. If Spotify could fill playlists with cheaper music, was it quietly trying to reduce its dependence on the companies that held all the power? Spotify never framed it that way publicly, but the timing made people curious. For years, the company had been squeezed from every direction. Users wanted low subscription prices. Artists wanted higher payouts. Labels wanted larger licensing agreements. Investors wanted profits. Something eventually had to give. Before Spotify could fully solve any of those problems, another threat arrived. And this time, it wasn't coming from Apple Taylor Swift, or the record labels. It was coming from artificial intelligence. A few years ago, Spotify crossed a milestone that would have sounded absurd when the company launched. More than 500 million people were using the platform. Spotify was handling hundreds of billions of streams every year. It had survived piracy, lawsuits, angry artists, Apple, Amazon, YouTube, podcast controversies, layoffs, and years of questions about profitability. Most businesses don't survive one of those challenges. Spotify somehow survived all of them. Yet one fact still stands out. The company spent nearly 2 decades becoming the most important gateway to music on the internet without ever owning most of the music people came to hear. It's a strange position to be in. Imagine building the busiest airport in the world while somebody else owns most of the airplanes. That's essentially the business Daniel Ek created. Now, the industry is changing again. In 2024, more than 120,000 songs were being uploaded to streaming services every single day. To understand how absurd that number is, imagine listening to music 24 hours a day without stopping. You would still fall behind faster than you could catch up. The music industry spent 20 years worrying about scarcity. Now it's facing the opposite problem: infinite supply. AI tools are making music creation faster than ever. Songs that once took weeks can now be generated in minutes. The challenge is no longer getting music into the world. The challenge is getting anyone to notice it. That's why Spotify keeps expanding beyond music. Podcasts, audiobooks, advertising, recommendation systems. The company understands something most people miss. Music streaming is no longer the destination. It's the entry point. For years, investors looked at Spotify and asked why the company wasn't making the kind of money they expected. Maybe they were looking at the wrong business. Spotify was never trying to become a record label. It was trying to become the place where all audio begins. Whether that strategy ultimately works remains unclear. What is clear is that Daniel Ek solved a problem the music industry couldn't solve. He made legal music more convenient than piracy. He changed how hundreds of millions of people listen to music. He built the largest audio platform on Earth. But after nearly 2 decades, Spotify is still wrestling with the same question that existed on day one. Can a company truly control an industry if it doesn't own the thing people come for? Because for all of Spotify's success, for all its growth, and for all its influence, one fact has never changed. The music was never theirs.
Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. I truly hope these words inspired you, motivated you, and gave you something valuable to take with you into everyday life. If you enjoyed this recording, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore my other inspiring audiobooks created to support your growth, mindset, and motivation. Your support means a lot and helps me create more content for listeners like you. See you in the next audiobook.